KrisAnne Hall is an attorney and former prosecutor who travels the country teaching the Constitution and the history that gave us our founding documents. KrisAnne will connect the dots for you like no one else can. As host of the KrisAnne Hall Show, she pulls no punches, puts liberty first, and gives no quarter to those who hide behind party labels. KrisAnne will tell you what the founders had to say on today's relevant issues. She is an author of Not a Living, Breathing Document, Reclaiming Our Constitution, and the DVD series The Roots of Liberty for Junior Patriots. She's a multiple award winner for her patriotism. KrisAnne is an incredibly passionate speaker, a true Patrick Henry of our time. She speaks to audiences all across the country on constitutional history, American exceptionalism, and the fight for liberty. Her passion and enthusiasm are contagious. See for yourself as we welcome to the stage KrisAnne Hall.
Hello, everybody. Am I among the blessed? Amen. If you don't know how blessed you are, then I don't think I can help you anymore today. How many of you have pocket constitutions with you right now? All right. I want you to get your pocket constitutions out if you have them, and I want you to turn to the Declaration of Independence. We are going to be covering that today. This is something that's going to be very important. Now, what we need to realize is, what is the job description of our representatives? Well, the legislators of Virginia in 1799 gave us the best definition that I have ever found of the job description of our representatives. Everybody that we've elected to represent us took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. They are, if they are not going to shrink from their representative responsibilities, they must be the guardians of the state's sovereignty. This is something that we have to really grasp today. One of the single most important things we will learn today is state sovereignty. If the states are not sovereign, then the entire republic falls apart. This is the entire principle that hinges all these other things together. So, in order to fulfill their oath, I do swear that I will support the Constitution of the United States. They must be the guardians of the state's sovereignty. Now, they come and they tell us, look, we understand that this is our job and that we cannot shrink from it, but we also recognize it will not be an easy job to do, because, you see, we will have to warn you of federal encroachments, because federal encroachments are the enemy to state sovereignty. Federal encroachments, everybody knows what that is, right? That's federal dollars with federal dictate, federal regulations. Those are the encroachments. Imagine that. Our states are supposed to warn us against federal encroachments and not compete for them. Now, I say it's going to be a challenge to do that, because these encroachments may be pretext with the clothed in the pretext of necessity. Because, you see, we must have national health care. If we don't have national health care, we're all going to die. I got bad news for you. We're all going to die. National health care just allows the federal government to decide where, when, and how we die. Now, these people also said not only be clothed in the pretext of necessity, but maybe even disguised by the arguments of expediency, because, you know, we have to pass the bill so we can read the bill. And I will remind you, this was 1799, not 1999. Why? Because there is nothing new under the sun. So what do we need to know in order to understand sovereignty? We've got to get back to some basics, and I mean real building block basics. And here's your first question. This is a workshop, which means I need you to join in and respond. Which came first, the states or the federal government? Obviously, no brainer. But if we really, really thought about that, and if we really, really knew that, not just here, but here, we wouldn't even be having the issues that we have today. So here's what we have to look. We have to look at the chronology of the fact that the states existed prior to the federal government. The first thing we need to understand is that we did not become independent from Great Britain on July 4th, 1776 with the signing of the Declaration of Independence. We did not. We became independent from Great Britain 2 days prior on July 2nd, 1776, when the Continental Congress ratified the Lee Resolution. The Lee Resolution was a legislative act, a 3-step process to becoming independent from Great Britain. And on July 2nd, 1776, the Continental Congress brought to the floor the Lee Resolution. They debated, they voted, and they ratified into law our independence. What they did on July 2nd was just as legally binding as anything that Congress does today that's constitutional. John Adams would write home to Abigail on July 3rd and say, July 2nd will be an epic day where Americans will celebrate their independence forever. And then on July 4th, we published it in the newspapers. And we're also apt to believe what they say in the newspapers rather than what happens in Congress, right? So knowing that, we know that the states existed prior to the Declaration of Independence by 2 days. Do we have a federal government yet? No. Which means our states existed prior to the Articles of Confederation. Now, Articles of Confederation were our first attempt at a union. It did not work. It did not work because they created a central government so small it could not perform the functions they wanted it to perform. So they had to move on to the more perfect union, which we now call our current Constitution. Now, something happened in this chronology that's very, very important. You see that blank space between the Articles of Confederation and the more perfect union? In that blank space, our Continental Congress dissolved the Articles of Confederation. Which means in that space, they dissolved the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. So there is no central government anymore until we ratify the more perfect union. So, at the time the Constitution was ratified, what is the only form of government that existed? States. This is very, very important. So what is a state? This is where we're going to look at your Declaration of Independence. This is very important. This is the last paragraph in the Declaration of Independence. It is nearly verbatim to the first clause of the Lee Resolution. And we'll look at this right now. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America. Now, the grammar in this is very, very important because someone will try to deceive you and tell you that even in the Declaration of Independence, they anticipated a federal government. And so when they're talking about power in the Declaration of Independence, they're talking about this federal government that they wanted to create. You can laugh now because that's ridiculous, but nonetheless, I want to arm you with the tools to defeat that. And the key to that is in the language itself. You see that United States of America is not a proper noun. That U is not capitalized. Because the U is not a proper noun. The U is an adjective to describe the condition of the states being unified in their declaration. In general, Congress assembled, appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, those crazy atheists, do in the name and by the authority of the British Crown. Is that what that says? No. You see, in the authority of the good people was a spit in the eye to the king, because when you live in a kingdom, the people have no authority. The king carries all the authority. And so now the people are saying, hey, because we are created by God, by the authority of the supreme judge of the world, we now hold the power to declare, because some things are self-evident, that we are created by our Creator. And we can declare without the authority of the king that we are independent. So, that by the good people of these colonies solemnly publish and declare, see, we didn't become independent, we published and declared it, that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. Now that tells us there's a difference between a colony and a state, right? A colony is not free and independent. A colony can do nothing without the permission of the king. A state, however, is free and independent. But what does that mean, this word state? So go now to the rest of that last paragraph. Remember, we left off in the last slide with free and independent states. And now we say that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British crown, and that all political connection between them and the what? State of what? Great Britain. See, that word state is not simply synonymous with North Carolina, Delaware, or Rhode Island. That word state is synonymous with Great Britain, France, and Spain. We did not create North Carolina, Rhode Island, or Delaware as subsets of a union. We created 13 independent sovereign countries. How do we know that? Because that's what it says. And that ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have. Who is the they? The states. This is the power that the states have. Full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states like Great Britain, France, and Spain may of right do. Every state ever created was created as an independent, free country. Somebody's going to try to tell you, well, that doesn't apply to Oklahoma, because Oklahoma came after the first 13. Now, you won't see me quote the Supreme Court often, because I deal with constitutional issues and state sovereignty, and the Supreme Court has no authority to define either of those things. But sometimes they get it right, and it's nice to acknowledge it, right? We just learned we need to award for positive behavior, right? So they said, they have this doctrine called the doctrine of equal footing. It says every state that enters the Union after the first 13 enters the Union on the same footing as the first 13, and there's that big fat footprint. Someone will now try to tell you, well, that's fine and good. You entered on that same footing. But when you joined the Union, you surrendered your sovereignty. That is ridiculous. It's not even legally logical. But let's think about this. How many of you know of a sovereign country named Germany? Didn't Germany join the European Union? Okay, so fly over to Germany, tell the German chancellor and the German people that they are no longer a sovereign, independent country because they joined the EU. How is that going to go over there? So why do we accept it here? So what do we, now that we know what a state is, it's an independent, free country, what is the Constitution? Well, the Constitution, legally speaking, is a contract. Now, our framers will refer to it time and time again as a compact, which is even more telling, because a contract is a legally binding agreement between sovereign people. A compact is a legally binding agreement between sovereign governments. And the Constitution is a compact, which means it is a contractual agreement between sovereign governments. What were the only sovereign governments that existed prior to the ratification of the Constitution? The states. There was no federal government, no executive, no judicial, no legislative prior to the ratification of the Constitution. So the only sovereignties that existed at the time the Constitution ratified were the states, which means that the states created the Constitution, right? They're the only ones that did. Somebody will probably try to tell you that the Constitution is an agreement between the people and the federal government. That is not true. The Constitution was not ratified by popular vote. It was ratified by 3/4 of the states. Someone will try to tell you that the Constitution is agreement between the federal government and the states. That is a temporal impossibility because the federal government did not exist until the Constitution was ratified. You have parties to a contract and you have products of a contract. The central government is the product of the contract. The product of the contract cannot be a party to the contract because it doesn't exist until the contract is signed. It's a temporal impossibility. So the only sovereignties that existed were the states, which means the states created the Constitution. The Constitution created the federal government, which means the federal government is a creation of the states. Now there's a very important principle that we must acknowledge here. If the states created the federal government, then it follows that the states are the higher authority. Because a creator cannot create something greater than itself. It is a self-evident principle that the creators of the national compact are the rightful judges and guardians of that compact. You cannot create something more powerful than yourself. And the states, being the creators of that compact and of the central government, enumerated the central government's specific powers, created a limited central government, and did the most important thing they will ever do in the creation of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. They reserved all other powers to themselves. What is this power placement? Because this is the key. James Madison explains in Federalist 45 how the power placement goes. He says the powers delegated by the Constitution, or to the, how does that go? The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those that remain in the states are numerous and indefinite. He says the powers delegated to the federal government by the Constitution are reserved to external objects. Remember what that meant? Foreign affairs. And then he tells us war, peace, negotiation, foreign commerce, things like that. Anybody remember where we first found that yesterday? The Ethelred Agreement of 1014. And then he says, all other powers are reserved to the states. The powers reserved to the several states will extend to all the objects which in the ordinary course of affairs concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people and the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state. If it is not foreign affairs, it is reserved to the states. Is healthcare a foreign affair? Is land management a foreign affair? Is education a foreign affair? Is transportation a foreign affair? Is the EPA a foreign affair? Then these are powers that are to be reserved to the states. So, Jefferson tells us in the Kentucky Resolution, whenever the general government assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. This is a very, very important legal principle. And it would be just as true if Jefferson said it as if Mickey Mouse said it. Okay? Because this is a principle, a truism. If I steal your car, do I have the authority to use it? No. Do I have the authority to sell it? If I sell your car, is that sale legally binding? Does it have legal force? Do you have to sue me to get your car back? No, you simply have to show the title deed to your car, and then the sheriff has to return the car to you. If I sold your car, the poor sap that bought it's the one that's got to fight to get his money back. So if the federal government is doing more than foreign affairs, healthcare, education, drug enforcement, land management, environment, whatever, do they have the authority to exercise that power? If they exercise that power, does that exercise of that power have legal force? Do you have to sue the federal government as the state of Oklahoma to get your power back? No! All you have to do is show the title deed. What is the title deed to your power? The Constitution. And there you see the difference between assumed authority and legal authority. Because when you allow someone to drive around in your stolen car all day, everybody who looks at them assumes they have the authority to do that until you stand up and exercise your legal authority over that thing. If the federal government is using power that has not been delegated, it is theft. And that is an illegal act. So this is not our first rodeo with the federal government out of control. We don't teach this part of history because, the federal government doesn't want to raise up children believing that government is limited. How ridiculous is that we turn our children over to the government to be taught, and then we're surprised when our children are taught that the government is all-knowing, all-powerful, that the parents are stupid, and the churches are stupid, and God is unnecessary and irrelevant. What government can teach God? They can't, because God, if they teach God, they teach that there is a power higher than themselves. John Calhoun tells us this very important principle of reserved. The doctrine which denies to the states the right of protecting their reserved powers. That word reserved is very, very important. Let's just pretend that right there on that pew is a sign that says, this space reserved for KrisAnne Hall. If someone else sits in that space, what do I have the authority to do? Kick them out, because it's reserved to me. If it says reserved and I do not have the authority to kick them out, is it really reserved? No. And that's what Calhoun is saying. He's saying if you eliminate the power of the states to secure unto themselves the things that have been reserved unto them, then you make those powers not reserved. And what that means is we are no longer sovereign states, but we are colonies subject to the whim of the federal government. Because the federal government can say, oh yeah, all you did was delegate to us foreign affairs, but today we're going to do education and you got to like it. Today we're going to do environment and you got to like it. And if the states cannot protect what is reserved to them, then they are in submission to the federal government for whatever their whim is. Is that a limited federal government? Is that a defined federal government? Well, it is. It's a limited and defined federal government by its own will. And when a government is defined and limited by its own will, that is not a constitutional republic, that is a totalitarian regime. That is contrary to the sovereignty of the state, and when you remove the sovereignty of the state, you also destroy the Constitution itself. Now, how many of you, after yesterday's lesson, saw the history unfold in front of our eyes? So we should not be surprised, knowing that our framers knew this history, that they actually anticipated today's government. They did. They hoped that we would be a nation more prosperous than we'd ever seen. But they knew there was a danger in prosperity. They knew we would become pacified in prosperity, lazy in luxury, and complacent and compliant within our comfort. And when that happens, government becomes our provider, and we are left to being tributary subjects. And so within our designed constitutional republic, they placed the solution. The solution exists with the sovereignty of the states. In the case of deliberate, palpable, and dangerous exercise of other powers not granted, who? The states have the right and are duty-bound to interpose. What does that mean? Because those powers are reserved to the states not as a whole, but those states individually. Remember, they're individual, sovereign, independent, free countries. And they have a right to and a duty to reserve what's to them, because they have a duty to prevent the central government from becoming an unlimited government and make us subjects again. Interposition. Jefferson would call that nullification. Nullification is the exact thing that you have been hearing about for the last 2 days. Nullification is the embodiment in the political realm of Acts 5:29. I will obey God rather than men. Nullification is not based on the fact that Madison and Jefferson say it's right and valid. It's based on the principles of sovereignty and natural law. It's an outworking of the biblical principle sown into our constitutional foundation, the principle declared in Acts 5:29 that we should obey God rather than men, and that when law conflicts with a higher law, it is no law at all. And that's what we need to understand about this principle. He says that the several states who formed the Constitution, see, I didn't make that up, being what? And have the unquestionable right to judge of their creation's deviation from its creation. And that a nullification by those what? Who are the sovereignties? Of all unauthorized acts by their creation is the rightful remedy. Not right because Jefferson says it's right, but right meaning full of rights because it's a natural right, being delegated the authority to reserve what is theirs. Now, this is boot camp. I am not here to entertain you. I am not here to instruct you. I am here to recruit you to get boots on the ground and start talking about this stuff and start teaching this stuff for yourself. Because if you leave this room unchanged, unmotivated, and silent, then every speaker over the last 2 days has just spoken to an empty room. We are giving you the tools to be in this kingdom battle, and we must now choose to pick up these tools and engage in that battle. Some people are going to tell you nullification's not allowed because the Supreme Court said so, because the Supremacy Clause prohibits it, or perhaps because it's not in the Constitution. Let's look at all of these things. Madison disagrees with the whole Supreme Court premise, and I'm going to show you 3 quotes by Madison about these principles. If the decisions of the judiciary be raised above the authority of the sovereign parties to the Constitution. Who are the sovereign parties to the Constitution? If the decisions of the judiciary be raised above the authority of the states, dangerous powers not delegated may not only be usurped and executed by the other departments, but also the judicial department may exercise or sanction dangerous powers beyond the grant of the Constitution. Why? Because the states are the creators, and it's their duty to control their creation. And if the creation becomes greater than the creator, well, Mary Shelley wrote a book about that. We will have a Frankenstein federal government. says, consequently, the ultimate right of the parties to the Constitution. Who are the parties to the Constitution? The ultimate right of the states to judge whether that compact, the Constitution, has been dangerously violated, must extend to violations by one delegated authority as well as by another, by the judiciary as well as by the executive or the legislative. The Supreme Court does not have the authority, was never delegated the authority to broaden the power of the federal government, which shows us that the federal government, through the judicial branch, bringing marriage into the federal fold is an illegal, unlawful act and has no power. Now, in this kingdom battle, somebody is going to try to bring to your attention some places where Madison seems to contradict what he says. But you have to understand he does not contradict himself. You have to understand within the context what all of this means. Is it logical to believe that a man would change his opinion in public over and over and over again and sort of flip-flop? Or is it better to believe that maybe he's actually saying the same thing, but in different context? So keep that in mind when you're thinking about these interpretations. Do not take quotes, take context. How many of you seen Bible doctrine created out of one scripture? Okay? All right. Madison is, in 1789, arguing for the ratification of the Bill of Rights into the Constitution. Now, there was an argument. We should not have a Bill of Rights because the feds will use them against us. If we make a list, they'll be able to say, that's not on the list. Since it's not on the list, you must have meant for us to regulate it. Or if it's on the list, they'll say, oh, it's on the list. We certainly don't want to abridge it. But what is that press thing anyway? And then they will define it. And they'll say this is press, obviously, because 200 years ago they had this, so they must have meant press this. But this internet thing, they didn't have internet in 200 years ago, so they must not have meant internet when they said press, so it must be okay for us to regulate it. Now, the other argument in favor of it was that we must have a Bill of Rights because the people will fall asleep and they will fail to limit the government to its limited and defined powers. So we need this Bill of Rights not as a further limit of their power, because we can't limit them any further than only giving them these few things, but as a limit in the sense that we remind the people of their inalienable rights so that when the government comes close to it, Patrick Henry said, when anyone approaches the jewel of liberty, an alarm will go off in our eyes and in our senses and say, hey, you're not allowed to be there. You must go. Now, Madison made a promise to the state of Virginia that he would make sure we had this Bill of Rights, so he's going to come with a solution. And he says, if they, the Bill of Rights, are incorporated into the Constitution, independent tribunals of justice will consider themselves in a peculiar manner the guardians of those rights. They will be an impenetrable bulwark against every assumption of power and the legislative or executive. He's trumpeting the courts, not because he believes them to be the superior resource, but he knows something that you know now that the Supreme Court does not. The Constitution is a contract, and contract law has to be applied when interpreting it. And contract law says that when you read a contract and you don't understand the words in the contract or the meanings of the contract, you have to go to the drafters of the contract for that meaning. It's called the meeting of the minds. And Madison's saying, look, if they don't know what press means, they will have to, by contract law, come back to us for the definition. The irony of ironies, the Constitution is the only contract in the United States where courts and judges and lawyers refuse to apply contract law. But he doesn't stop there. He gives us the greater solution. Besides this security of the courts, there is a great probability that the Bill of Rights in the system would be enforced because the state legislatures will jealously and closely watch the operations of this federal government and be able to resist with more effect every other assumption of power on earth than any other power can do. And the greatest opponent to a federal government admit the state legislators to be the sure guardians of the liberty. How many people in your capital know that your representatives, your county commissioners, your city councilmen, your sheriff are supposed to be the greatest opponent to the federal government and not their best friend? The Supremacy Clause. This is my favorite argument. Hamilton tells us in Federalist 78, no legislative act, therefore, contrary to the Constitution, can be valid. I don't think you can get any simpler than that. I know we live in a society where we like to redefine the meaning of the word is, but no still means no. And Hamilton says, if you allow legislative acts contrary to the Constitution to be valid, you will allow the deputy to be greater than his principal, the servant above his master. You see that? The states are the master over the federal government. And he says, if you go long enough, you will find a situation where the representatives of the people find themselves superior to the people themselves. So let's look at this Supremacy Clause. This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, shall be the supreme law of the land. Doesn't get any simpler than that. From that reading, we understand the Constitution is the supreme law of the land without any qualifier. But in order for the laws of Congress to be supreme law of the land, they must be made in compliance to the Constitution, which means if they are not limited to foreign affairs, if Congress makes laws about welfare to the people, environment, education, regulations, all of those things are not consistent with the Constitution. They are contrary to the Constitution. Therefore, they are not the supreme law of the land, and as a matter of fact, they are no law at all. And we ought to obey God rather than men. Not in the Constitution? Well, that's actually very good news. Because you see, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution are reserved to the states. So the fact that it's not in the Constitution tells us it is a power reserved to the states. Why? Because the people in the Ninth Amendment have declared we are the owners of all the rights. We have the authority to delegate this power, and the states have the requirement to protect what is reserved to them. The right to nullification. If the federal government is not limited and defined by the Constitution, why do we have a Constitution? Why didn't we just go ahead and set up a kingdom and say when it gets out of control, we'll just run around and chop off heads like we used to? Why? Because our framers wanted to preserve liberty in a way that did not require revolution. By the way, I am fully believing we need a revolution today. We must have a revolution today. But not a revolution with swords and guillotines. We need a revolution of the mind and the spirit. If the federal government is not limited in its power by the Constitution, then what is its limit? Its own will. A government limited by its own will is one that is not limited at all. Therefore, in order to save the republic, the states must defend what is reserved to them and control their creation. Nullification is not a philosophy. Nullification is not a theory. Nullification is based on the principles in the Bible that we must obey God rather than men, that there is a natural order of power, and that when the creation assumes itself to be superior to the Creator, it is out of order. Justice Roberts happens to agree with nullification. This is the original opinion with the first case on the Affordable Care Act, and I practically jumped out of my seat when I saw this. We look to the states, he says, to defend their prerogatives by adopting the simple expedient of not yielding to federal blandishments when they do not want to embrace the federal policies as their own. And then he says this: the states are separate and independent sovereigns. Hallelujah! And then he says, sometimes they gotta act like it. Oklahoma, it is time you start acting like an independent sovereign state and start standing for the natural law and order of things. Now, I'm running out of time, so I got to keep moving here. Somebody's going to tell you nullification doesn't work, it can't work, but it is working. Go to this website, the 10thamendmentcenter.com. There are over 300 pieces of legislation that have already been passed by the states, the counties, and the municipalities across the country, or are in works of being passed. These are the things that we must understand. This is the right now solution to getting the federal government under control. It is the natural order of what we need to do. You go to your local government and say, hey, you need to do this, and they're going to say, but we can't have our schools without federal funding. How will we run our hospitals without federal funding? We'll starve to death without federal funding. Hamilton's got a warning for that. Is it not better, I ask, to suffer a few present inconveniences than to put yourselves in the way of losing everything that is precious? Your lives, your property, your religion are all at stake. I do my duty, I warn you of danger. If you should still be so mad as to bring destruction upon yourselves, if you should still neglect what you owe to God and man, you cannot plead ignorance in your excuse. Your consciences will reproach you for your folly, and your children's children will curse you. What kind of legacy do you want for your children? What kind of legacy do you want for yourself? We live in a place where we have unlimited government regulation, and we're about to raise children comfortable with unlimited government surveillance. Winston Churchill said, if you will not fight for the right when you can easily win without bloodshed, if you will not fight when the victory is sure and not too costly, you may have to fight with all the odds against you and only a precarious chance of survival. He said there may even be a worse case. You may have to fight when there is no hope, because it's better to perish than to live as a slave. I know history. I know how it repeats. If you are under the age of 25, stand up in this room right now. I want you to look around. I want you to look around because I know history and I know how it repeats. And these people will have to buy back a gift that we were supposed to give to them. And they will not do it at the ballot box. They will do it with their blood. And from this day forward, I want you to look at all the faces in your community and say, what kind of legacy do I want? Do you want these people to curse you? Or do you want them to say, you know, we messed up, but we stood up and we protected what was theirs? Because that's the choice we have to make. And our children are depending upon us. So what are you going to do? Are you going to let them stand alone? Now, I'm out of time. I know that. They're gonna pull the hook out here shortly. But I just want to mention to you, if you didn't have time to write down everything that I said, this book tells you everything that I said. If you have questions about other issues like the power of the sheriff and Article 5 conventions, this book will answer a lot of those questions for you. Not from my opinion, because I got 1,000 and they don't matter, but from fact and history and principle. God bless. Thank you so much.